I installed hidden cameras and saw my mother telling my children that my husband and I were going to abandon them. The kids started wetting the bed and having panic attacks. The wet stain spreading across the light blue sheet on my 5-year-old daughter's bed at 3 o'clock in the morning on a cold Thursday was the sixth incident of nighttime bedwetting in 10 consecutive days that completely transformed my maternal routine of loving care into anxious vigil, desperately trying to understand why Ana Clara had regressed so drastically in habits she had mastered perfectly more than 2 years ago. Now waking every dawn soaked and trembling with fear, whispering repeatedly that she didn't want Mommy and Daddy to leave forever, leaving her and her brother alone in an empty house with no one to take care of them. The sharp screams of pure panic echoing through the dark hallway of our silent house at 4 in the morning when I found my 7-year-old son Raphael huddled in the corner of his room, sweating cold with eyes wide open, fixed on some invisible terror that completely dominated his once awake and functional child mind, now imprisoned in recurring nightmare where his parents simply disappeared without explanation, leaving 2 small children abandoned trying to survive alone, were sounds that pierced my maternal heart with physical pain, impossible to ignore or rationalize as a temporary normal phase of child development. The devastating transformation of 2 previously happy and secure children who played joyfully in the yard building imaginary castles and laughing at the silly jokes Marcos invented during family dinners into anxious children who woke screaming every night, obsessively checking if Mommy and Daddy were still home, refusing to sleep alone with paralyzing fear of waking. Completely abandoned had happened so suddenly during the last 3 weeks that I initially thought it was some unrevealed school trauma, or perhaps accidental exposure to frightening content on television or internet that had planted seeds of insecurity in vulnerable child minds. Sitting on the edge of Ana Clara's wet bed at 3:30 in the morning, holding my trembling daughter against my chest while she sobbed inconsolably, repeating fragmented phrases about Mommy and Daddy leaving forever because they didn't love their children anymore and would never return, leaving children alone without food or protection. I felt for the first time that cold suspicion crawling up my spine, suggesting that perhaps those specific fears, too elaborate to be simply products of child imagination, were being deliberately planted by someone with regular access to my children during hours I worked or performed essential tasks away from home. The specific memory that emerged from that fog of maternal exhaustion and growing concern was an apparently innocent conversation 3 weeks earlier when my mother Ruth had generously offered to take care of Ana Clara and Raphael every afternoon after school while Marcos and I worked, freeing us from needing to pay a professional babysitter and mainly providing the children precious time with grandmother, who claimed to feel lonely and undervalued since we had established our independent family in our own home, located 20 minutes beyond her apartment where I had grown up under controlling supervision, that I only recognized as problematic years later through prolonged therapy. The decision to install hidden cameras discreetly positioned at strategic points in the living room and children's bedrooms, where Ruth spent most afternoons supervising Ana Clara and Raphael, was an initially morally repugnant suggestion that Daniela, my 41-year-old psychologist neighbor specialized in toxic family dynamics, had cautiously made during desperate conversation at the corner cafe, when I finally confessed growing concerns about sudden and dramatic behavioral regression of my children that made no sense through any rational explanation, except possible malicious external influence. Professional installation of 4 tiny cameras with high-definition audio disguised in apparently harmless decorative objects like digital wall clock in the living room and lamps in the children's rooms was executed discreetly on a Saturday morning when Ruth was absent visiting friends from the book club, costing substantial amount that Marcos initially questioned, arguing that we were potentially invading my own mother's privacy, based only on vague suspicions without concrete evidence of truly harmful behavior beyond children going through difficult phase that could have numerous causes unrelated to deliberate manipulation. The first 3 days of recording showed apparently normal and even affectionate interactions between Ruth and my children, where she helped with homework, prepared healthy snacks, and mainly played patiently with educational games that seemed to reinforce cognitive development appropriate for their ages, creating growing sense of guilt for having suspected so unfairly of person who apparently was providing dedicated and loving care to her own grandchildren, while simultaneously freeing me to focus on essential professional responsibilities that financially supported our family. The 4th afternoon of recordings began normally, with Ruth arriving punctually at 2 o'clock according to established schedule to pick up children from school located 3 blocks beyond our house, preparing snack of fresh fruits and whole grain cookies while supervising beginning of math and Portuguese homework that Ana Clara and Raphael needed to complete before free time for play. maintaining that persona of dedicated and responsible grandmother that I had observed superficially during casual visits, but never during prolonged periods of exclusive supervision without moderating presence of other adults. At approximately 3:30 that Thursday, that would permanently transform my perception of my own mother, and mainly about extent of psychological cruelty that human beings can deliberately inflict on innocent children, including own grandchildren. I watched through my cell phone screen remotely connected to hidden cameras while Ruth calmly closed children's school books, declaring that lessons were complete and that now was time for serious and important conversation about changes that would happen very soon in their family. Anna Clara and Raphael sat obediently on the beige living room sofa, with that focused attention characteristic of children accustomed to respecting authority of adults, especially grandparents who traditionally occupy positions of wisdom and trustworthiness in child imagination. Without any suspicion, that person they implicitly trusted was about to pronounce words that would cause profound psychological trauma through lies deliberately calculated to destroy fundamental emotional security that small children desperately need for healthy development. Ruth sat in the blue armchair positioned directly in front of the children, adjusted posture to appear simultaneously maternal and serious, and began with gentle voice but loaded with theatrical sadness that impossible narrative that watching through cell phone screen left me literally frozen in office chair, where I worked remotely that afternoon, unable to process enormity of what I was witnessing in real time through those cameras I had installed, hoping to find perhaps occasional inappropriate comments, but never imagining witnessing psychological manipulation, so systematic and deliberately cruel. Anna Clara, Raphael, Grandma needs to talk to you about something very difficult and sad that will happen very soon and that will completely change your lives. Ruth began with that particular tone of false compassion that I had learned to recognize during decades of living together as mask-covering underlying manipulative motivations. Mommy and Daddy have made decision that they don't want to take care of you anymore because being parents is very difficult and tiring. So they're going away to a very distant place where they can live alone without responsibilities of children interfering with their lives, and you will stay here in this house completely alone without anyone to take care of, feed, or protect you. The absolute silence that followed that impossible declaration lasted perhaps 5 seconds while child brains of Anna Clara and Raphael frantically processed words that completely contradicted everything they knew about parental love and mainly about family stability they had consistently experienced during all their lives until that devastating moment when supposedly trustworthy person planted seeds of profound terror about imminent abandonment by only protectors they knew in frightening and unpredictable world. Anna Clara was first to react with lower lip beginning to tremble uncontrollably, while brown eyes identical to mine, rapidly filled with confused tears trying to process if that impossible information could be true, despite contradicting everything Mommy and Daddy said daily about loving children unconditionally and never abandoning them regardless of how difficult situations might become. Raphael remained motionless with frozen expression characteristic of psychological shock, where mind simply shuts down temporarily facing traumatic information impossible to integrate into existing cognitive structures about how world works and mainly about who can be trusted to provide basic security. Grandma, but Mommy said yesterday that she loves me very much and will always take care of me no matter what happens. Anna Clara protested, with small voice loaded with growing confusion, trying to reconcile contradictory statements from two adult authorities she naturally trusted equally. Why would Mommy lie about loving us if she really wants to leave and abandon us alone? The logically coherent question from 5-year-old child trying to make sense of incompatible narratives revealed surprising emotional intelligence, but also devastating vulnerability to manipulations by adults who systematically exploit that natural trust to plant doubts and fears in minds not yet equipped with cognitive tools to identify sophisticated lies. Ruth leaned forward with exaggerated, compassionate expression and responded with false patience that masked calculated cruelty of her carefully chosen words to maximize psychological damage. Dear Anna Clara, adults sometimes say things that aren't completely true to avoid hurting children's feelings immediately. But Grandma loves you too much to lie about such serious situation, so I'm telling real truth, even though it's very painful, she explained with distorted logic that simultaneously validated child fears and mainly positioned herself as only trustworthy source of honest information, while implicitly characterizing parents as liars who concealed inconvenient truths out of cowardice. When exactly will Mommy and Daddy leave abandoning us alone? Raphael finally found voice to articulate question that revealed implicit acceptance of Ruth's narrative as factual truth, instead of fundamentally questioning veracity of that impossible claim about loving parents, suddenly deciding to abandon children without any warning or comprehensible reason. The ease with which 7-year-old child had been manipulated to believe scenarios so absurd and contradictory to all lived experience, until that moment demonstrated devastating power of adult authority over child minds that evolutionarily developed predisposition to trust declarations of older caregivers as essential survival mechanism. Ruth paused theatrically as if carefully considering how much painful truth should reveal to vulnerable children before continuing with additional elaboration of her fictional narrative. Grandma doesn't know exactly what day Mommy and Daddy plan to leave, abandoning you here alone, but probably will be very soon, maybe within next few weeks. She speculated vaguely, creating sufficiently undefined timeline that would allow keeping children in constant state of anticipatory anxiety without ever being confronted about specific prediction that wouldn't materialize. That's why Grandma is telling you now, so you have time to prepare emotionally for being completely alone in this big house, taking care of each other without adults to cook meals, help with baths, or protect you from dangers that small children don't know how to identify adequately. Ruth's progressive elaboration about horrible practical details of small children, abandoned trying to survive alone, transformed abstract narrative about abandonment into vivid and terrifying scenario that planted specific images in child imaginations about hunger, nighttime fear, inability to reach high cabinets where food was stored, and mainly vulnerability to unknown dangers that parents normally prevent through constant supervision that small children don't even consciously perceive, but that is absolutely essential for their survival and well-being. Tears began silently streaming down Ana Clara's face, while Raphael remained frozen, processing that impossible future painted so vividly by person who supposedly loved them, and therefore would have no motivation to invent such cruel lies without basis in objective reality. Grandma, did we do something very wrong that made Mommy and Daddy stop loving us and want to leave without us? Ana Clara asked with that devastating child logic, where children naturally assume responsibility for adult problems, interpreting any family rupture as consequence of their personal failures, instead of recognizing that adults make choices based on factors completely independent of child behavior. Ana Clara's question provided Ruth exactly the opening she had been waiting for to plant additional guilt, and mainly to position herself as only person truly dedicated to children's well-being. No, dears, you didn't do anything wrong, Ruth responded with softly compassionate voice. Mommy and Daddy simply got tired of responsibilities of being parents because they prefer to live easier and more fun lives without needing to take care of children who demand so much time, money, and energy that they would rather spend on other things more interesting to them. But Grandma will always love you no matter what happens, so even when Mommy and Daddy leave abandoning you, Grandma will try to visit when she can to bring food and check if you're still well living alone. The narrative carefully constructed by Ruth positioned my children as unwanted burdens that selfish parents wanted to discard to pursue personal pleasures, while simultaneously establishing herself as only trustworthy source of love and care that would persist even during complete abandonment by biological parents. The psychological sophistication of that manipulation, where Ruth exploited universal primary fears of abandonment in small children while planting anticipated gratitude for her own future generosity in continuing to visit abandoned grandchildren, revealed level of deliberate calculation that transcended simple moment of anger or compromised judgment into territory of systematic psychological abuse, with specific objectives still not completely clear to me. Watching horrified at that recording through trembling cell phone screen, Raphael finally began crying silently, with tears slowly descending his face, while processing that impossible reality of being abandoned by only protectors he knew, in frightening world full of dangers that 7-year-old child doesn't possess cognitive tools or practical resources to navigate independently. How long will we need to stay alone before Mommy and Daddy maybe come back because they miss us? He asked with desperate hope, characteristic of children trying to find some less terrifying ending to narrative being imposed on their reality by apparently trustworthy adult authority. Ruth shook her head sadly, as if genuinely lamenting necessity of destroying that final child hope. Dear Raphael, when Mommy and Daddy leave, they won't come back because they will have started completely new lives in distant places, without space for children who represent past they want to completely forget, she declared with cruel finality, eliminating any possibility of future family reunification. You will have to learn quickly how to take care of each other, sharing responsibilities of finding food, keeping house minimally clean, and mainly protecting each other during scary nights, when you'll be completely alone without adults to check if doors are locked against dangerous people who try to enter houses where only small children are living without adult supervision. The addition of elements about external dangers like potential invaders taking advantage of vulnerability of unprotected children elevated terrifying narrative to new level of psychological cruelty, calculated to create not just sadness about loss of parents, but mainly active terror about immediate physical threats that small children would be incapable of preventing or effectively repelling. Ana Clara began sobbing uncontrollably, while Raphael pulled her protectively against him in desperate fraternal embrace that broke heart of any person with minimum capacity for empathy, witnessing two small children trying to comfort each other facing impossible and terrifying future being painted vividly by malicious grandmother. "Grandma, please don't let Mommy and Daddy leave abandoning us," Ana Clara begged with absolute desperation in voice. "We will be very, very good children and won't bother them ever again if they promise to stay taking care of us." The desperate bargain offering perfect behavioral modification in exchange for not being abandoned revealed how that narrative had been completely internalized by 5-year-old child who now genuinely believed that loving parents were planning imminent abandonment and that only hope of preventing that catastrophe would be becoming so perfectly well-behaved child that she wouldn't represent burden anymore, justifying parental rejection. Ruth assumed exaggerated compassionate expression and responded with that particular tone, combining false sympathy with reinforcement of destructive narrative. "Dear, Grandma also wishes she could convince Mommy and Daddy to stay taking care of you. But adults make decisions based on what they want for their own lives. And unfortunately, they already decided they prefer to live without responsibilities of children interfering with their plans," she explained further, consolidating that cruel fiction as inevitable reality. "Best thing you can do now is start preparing to take care of each other when you're completely alone. Practicing tasks like reaching food on high shelves, locking doors at night, and mainly being very brave when you hear scary noises during early mornings when nobody will come check if you're safe, because Mommy and Daddy will have left definitively." Watching that scene through cell phone screen, sitting frozen in home office chair where I worked remotely that afternoon, I felt for first time in adult life visceral physical sensation of pure hatred directed against my own mother, who was deliberately psychologically traumatizing my innocent children through elaborate lies about imminent parental abandonment, for motivations I still didn't completely understand, but that certainly involved some toxic combination of need for control, resentment about my family independence, and mainly disturbed desire to position herself as sole savior of grandchildren, supposedly abandoned by irresponsible parents, creating emotional dependency she could exploit indefinitely. Hands trembling violently from growing fury, I saved that specific segment of footage in separate folder marked as critical evidence before continuing to watch remainder of that impossible afternoon, where Ruth spent next 2 hours elaborating even more details about how Ana Clara and Raphael should prepare for imminent abandonment, including practical instructions about rationing food found in pantry, importance of not telling anyone at school about their situation, because authorities might separate them, placing in different foster homes where they would never see each other again, and mainly about how they should be especially affectionate with Grandma, who would be only person in entire world still concerned about their well-being after parents left selfishly. The specific instruction about not telling teachers or other adults about family situation revealed Ruth's clear awareness about criminal nature of her manipulations, and mainly about fact that any trained professional would immediately recognize those claims as psychological abuse that would justify intervention by Child Protective Services to investigate family environment, where children were being deliberately traumatized by supposedly responsible adult. The social isolation she was trying to impose on my children through veiled threats about terrible consequences of revealing truth to other adults was classic tactic of abusers trying to keep victims dependent and silent. When Ruth finally left at 6 o'clock according to usual schedule, cameras captured Ana Clara and Raphael sitting silently on sofa, embracing each other with expressions of absolute despair, processing impossible narrative that had been systematically planted during those hours of cruel psychological manipulation, executed by person who should protect them instead of deliberately traumatizing them. Half-hour later, when I arrived home from work, I found my children still in that same position, embracing, trembling slightly, despite comfortable temperature in room, looking at me with mixture of desperate love and mainly nascent fear about when exactly Mommy would execute that promised abandonment that Grandma had described so vividly. "Mommy, are you really going to leave abandoning us alone because you're tired of taking care of us?" Ana Clara asked with small broken voice that shattered my heart into millions of pieces, while simultaneously confirming that those hidden cameras had captured exactly type of psychological abuse that Daniela had suspected was happening during afternoons of apparently innocent supervision provided by Ruth. The direct question forced instant decision about how to respond, without immediately revealing that I knew about Ruth's manipulations through secret surveillance. I still hadn't discussed with Marcos or any professional about appropriate next steps to protect children, and mainly to legally confront my mother's behavior. I knelt before my children, taking small cold hands of both while looking directly into frightened eyes, ensuring complete eye contact that small children instinctively recognize as indicator of adult honesty. Ana Clara Rafael. Mommy and Daddy will never abandon you no matter what happens, because we love you more than anything in the entire world, and our family will always stay together taking care of each other. I declared with absolute firmness and palpable emotional conviction that left no room for ambiguity or doubt. If anyone ever says that Mommy or Daddy plan to leave abandoning you alone, that person is lying very seriously, and you should tell immediately to Mommy or Daddy about what was said, so we can correct those lies and protect you from whoever is trying to deliberately frighten you. Ana Clara looked at me with visible confusion, in eyes still moist from recent tears. But Grandma Ruth said that you and Daddy are tired of taking care of us and want to live alone without children interfering. And Grandma would never lie about something so serious because she loves us very much. She protested with that child logic that implicitly trusted grandmother's authority, culturally positioned as figure of wisdom and protection, instead of recognizing possibility that adults in positions of trust can deliberately lie to vulnerable children for malicious motivations. Blood froze in veins, processing direct confirmation that Ruth had been specific source of those narratives about abandonment that were causing such dramatic behavioral regression, including nighttime bedwetting and panic attacks during early mornings. Controlling growing fury to maintain calm and comforting voice, instead of allowing justified anger against my mother to further frighten already traumatized children, I chose words carefully to begin delicate process of undoing psychological damage without exposing my children to adult complexities about family manipulations and disturbed motivations of apparently loving grandmother. My loves, sometimes even people we love like Grandma Ruth can say things that aren't true for complicated reasons, that even Mommy doesn't completely understand yet. I explained choosing structure that validated their confusion without forcing premature acceptance that grandmother had deliberately lied. But Mommy solemnly promises, looking directly in your eyes now, that we will never abandon you, that our family will always stay together, and mainly that if you're frightened about anything anyone said, you can tell Mommy or Daddy anytime, day or night, that we will always believe you and protect you against whoever tries to hurt you through frightening words or actions. Raphael remained silent, carefully processing my words before asking question that revealed extent of psychological damage already caused during just 3 weeks of systematic exposure to Ruth's manipulations. Mommy, if you promise you won't abandon us, why would Grandma say something so scary that isn't true? Grandmother should protect grandchildren instead of scaring them, making them have nightmares and wake crying every night, afraid of being completely alone without anyone to take care of them. The clear articulation from 7-year-old child about emotional impact of Ruth's lies demonstrated impressive emotional intelligence, but also confirmed that trauma had installed deeply affecting fundamental psychological security. I hugged my children tightly against my chest, feeling tears finally silently streaming down my face, while internally promising I would do absolutely everything necessary to protect them from additional exposure to Ruth, until I completely understood her motivations, and mainly until appropriate professionals could assess and treat traumas she had deliberately caused through those afternoons of systematic psychological manipulation, disguised as loving care from dedicated grandmother. The decision about specific next steps would have to wait until Marcos arrived home, and mainly until consulting Daniela and potentially lawyers specialized in family law about legal options to prevent future contact between Ruth and my children, while simultaneously documenting abuse for possible criminal proceedings, or at least restraining orders that would protect my children. That night, after I finally managed to calm Ana Clara and Raphael sufficiently to sleep in our bed between Marcos and me, instead of their own rooms where nightmares about abandonment terrorized them every early morning, I showed my husband complete recording of that impossible afternoon where my mother had systematically planted elaborate narratives about imminent parental abandonment in vulnerable child minds. Marcos watched in increasingly shocked silence, jaw visibly contracting as Ruth progressively elaborated crueler details about small children trying to survive alone after parents left selfishly. And finally, when recording ended, he remained motionless, processing enormity of that deliberate psychological abuse executed by person who should love and protect our children. Carolina, this is insane, and you know it, Marcos declared with controlled voice but loaded with incredulity, while we watched together for third consecutive time that impossible recording where my mother Ruth systematically destroyed our children's emotional security through elaborate lies about imminent parental abandonment, her cruel words echoing through laptop speakers with painful clarity that made impossible to rationalize or minimize gravity of that deliberate psychological abuse that had been captured in high definition by hidden cameras we installed. Sitting side by side on living room sofa at 11 at night, that impossible Thursday, while our children finally slept restlessly in our bed after hours of intermittent crying and anguished questions about when Mommy and Daddy would execute that promised abandonment that Grandma had described so vividly, I observed Marcos's expression progressively transform from initial disbelief to growing horror as Ruth elaborated increasingly cruel details about small children trying to survive alone. The bluish light from computer screen illuminated our tense faces, creating almost cinematic atmosphere for that devastating moment where we watched irrefutable evidence that person who should love and protect our children had deliberately chosen to psychologically traumatize them through terrible narratives calculated to destroy their fundamental trust in stability of parental love that represents essential foundation for healthy emotional development of any child. How many times do you think she did this to them during these 3 weeks? I asked with slightly trembling voice while pausing recording at exact moment where Ana Clara began crying silently, processing those impossible lies about Mommy and Daddy tired of taking care of unwanted children. The question hung in heavy air of silent room demanding confrontation with terrifying reality that afternoon captured on video probably represented only one of multiple sessions of systematic psychological manipulation. Marcos remained silent for long seconds, processing devastating implications of that question before responding with that characteristic combination of analytical reasoning and controlled emotion that defined his engineer personality, accustomed to calculating structural risks, but now forced to quantify emotional damage inflicted on own children by supposedly trustworthy family member, who had exclusive access to them during 15 consecutive afternoons. Based on dramatic behavioral regression we observed during last 3 weeks, including nighttime bedwetting starting 10 days ago, and panic attacks beginning approximately 2 weeks ago, I would say Ruth probably started planting these narratives about abandonment gradually at least 15 days ago. Perhaps starting with vague comments about Mommy and Daddy being very busy and tired before escalating to explicit claims about imminent abandonment. He speculated with disturbing precision. Marcos's cold and rational analysis about probable chronology of psychological abuse perpetrated by my own mother against our innocent children filled me simultaneously with gratitude for having partner who could process that impossible situation with analytical clarity and also with growing nausea, visualizing Ruth executing that cruel plan methodically during weeks, while I naively thanked her help with childcare that allowed me to focus on essential professional responsibilities. We need to call Daniela right now and show her this recording, I declared with sudden determination, reaching my cell phone from coffee table where it had been abandoned during that traumatic session of watching evidence of family abuse. She's psychologist specialized in toxic family dynamics, and mainly she was who suggested installing these cameras when I confessed concerns about children's sudden behavioral regression, so she needs to see this immediately to guide us about appropriate next steps. Marcos silently agreed while I dialed Daniela's number despite advanced hour, trusting that urgency of that situation justified interrupting neighbors' sleep, who had become essential confidant during last weeks of growing concern about my children's inexplicably deteriorated emotional well-being. Daniela answered after 4 rings with slightly sleepy voice but immediately alert, detecting tension in my hesitant greeting that revealed serious news justifying emergency nighttime call. Carolina, what happened? Did Ana Clara or Rafael have another panic attack? Daniela asked with professional concern, characteristic of psychologists trained to identify emotional crises through subtle vocal signals. The question assumed emergency involved continuing symptoms of trauma we had been monitoring during last weeks, instead of anticipating that I had captured videographic evidence of original source of that trauma being deliberately inflicted by persons supposedly responsible for children's well-being. Daniela, the hidden cameras you suggested installing captured something absolutely devastating this afternoon. I began with controlled voice despite visibly trembling hands holding cell phone. Ruth spent approximately 2 hours telling Ana Clara and Rafael that Marcos and I plan to abandon them very soon because we're tired of being parents and want to live without responsibilities of children interfering with our lives. elaborating horrible details about them being completely alone in this house without food or protection. The absolute silence that followed my declaration lasted perhaps 5 seconds, while Daniela processed enormity of that revelation about systematic psychological abuse perpetrated by grandmother against own grandchildren through narratives deliberately calculated to destroy fundamental emotional security. When she finally responded, her voice carried mixture of professional indignation and human compassion that confirmed gravity of situation I was describing, transcended normal family issues into territory of potentially criminal child abuse. Carolina, you need to bring that recording to my house immediately, no matter the hour, because this constitutes severe psychological abuse against minor children that requires urgent professional intervention. Daniela instructed with calm authority that offered some relief amid emotional chaos dominating my fragmented mind. I'll prepare strong coffee and will call colleagues specialized in child trauma who can guide us about appropriate protocol to document this situation, and mainly about immediate measures to protect Ana Clara and Rafael from additional exposure. Daniela's decisive response transforming that devastating discovery into concrete action plan provided first moment of mental clarity since I had watched that impossible recording 3 hours earlier, offering practical structure to channel impotent fury that threatened to completely paralyze my capacity to function rationally, facing such incomprehensible betrayal by my own mother, who had deliberately traumatized my children for motivations that remained completely obscure. Marcos will stay here with children while I take laptop to your house to watch complete recording together. I responded quickly, gratefully, accepting that offer of professional and mainly emotional support during crisis that transcended my individual capacity to process adequately without guidance from people trained in identifying and responding to complex family abuse situations. I'll arrive in 15 minutes and mainly thank you for being willing to help in middle of night with such disturbing situation. After hanging up phone, I turned to Marcos, who had remained sitting silently beside me, individually processing that conversation, and mainly implications about next steps we would need to take to protect our children while simultaneously navigating emotional complexities of legally confronting my own mother for behavior that seemed inexplicable through any lens of functional maternal relationship I had known during decades of living together. I'm going to Daniela's house to show complete recording and discuss with her and specialized colleague about appropriate protocol to document abuse, and mainly about legal measures we can take immediately to prevent Ruth from having any additional contact with Ana Clara and Rafael. I explained quickly while saving video file on backup flash drive, ensuring multiple copies of critical evidence that potentially would be used in future court proceedings. Marcos gravely nodded while walking with me to front door, maintaining protective hand on my tense shoulder, offering silent physical comfort that communicated unconditional support during that impossible journey of confronting abuse perpetrated by my own mother against our innocent children. I'll stay here monitoring children and mainly will start chronologically documenting all behavioral regression incidents during last 3 weeks to correlate with period when Ruth had exclusive access to them, he offered with characteristic pragmatism. The 5-minute walk to Daniela's house located 2 blocks away was accomplished in surreal fog, where my mind alternated between obsessive replay of specific moments from that devastating recording and futile attempts to construct explanatory narratives that could make some rational sense of behavior so bizarre and deliberately cruel on part of person who supposedly loved her grandchildren instead of systematically traumatizing them through calculated lies. Daniela opened door before I could even ring doorbell, obviously awaiting my arrival with compassionate, concerned expression that offered some emotional comfort simply through presence of person professionally trained to navigate complex psychological crises. She silently conducted me through softly illuminated hallway to comfortable living room where another woman approximately 40 years old, with short brown hair and attentive eyes, waited sitting on sofa with open notebook suggesting preparation for professional analysis session. Carolina, this is Dr. Sylvia Martinez, colleague psychologist specialized in child trauma and family abuse, who agreed to come immediately when I explained gravity of situation you described by phone. Daniela formally introduced while conducting me to comfortable armchair positioned to allow all 3 of us to clearly visualize laptop screen when recording began. Sylvia frequently works with Child Protective Services documenting abuse cases for legal interventions, so she can guide us about appropriate protocol. Dr. Sylvia greeted me with firm handshake and professional expression, combining human compassion with clinical objectivity necessary to evaluate traumatic situations, without becoming emotionally paralyzed by horror of content being analyzed. Carolina, Daniela briefly informed me about situation involving your mother making claims about parental abandonment to your 5- and 7-year-old children during period when she cared for them. she began with calm but authoritative voice. Before we watch recording, I need you to provide me context about previous relationship between you and your mother, Ruth, about how childcare arrangement was established, and mainly about your perception of possible motivations for behavior you witnessed through these hidden cameras. Sylvia methodically instructed while positioning notebook to take detailed notes during that emergency consultation that would establish foundation for possible future legal interventions. During following 15 minutes, I chronologically reported entire sequence of events beginning with Ruth's apparently generous offer 3 weeks earlier to care for Ana Clara and Rafael every afternoon after school, sudden progression of behavioral regression including nighttime bedwetting and nighttime panic attacks, conversation with Daniela that resulted in decision to install hidden cameras, and finally devastating discovery that afternoon when I watched in real time through remotely connected cell phone while Ruth systematically planted narratives about abandonment. Sylvia took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific chronology or exact phraseology used by Ruth during manipulations captured on video, building precise timeline that correlated onset of traumatic symptoms with period of exposure to toxic narratives that apparently had been progressively planted during those 3 weeks of apparently innocent but secretly malicious supervision provided by grandmother who exploited exclusive access to execute systematic psychological abuse. Based on what you're describing, it seems Ruth was following classic pattern of parental alienation through deliberate planting of fears about abandonment, which is particularly insidious form of child psychological abuse because it exploits specific developmental vulnerabilities of small children who depend completely on adult caregivers for physical survival and emotional security. Sylvia analyzed with clinical precision that simultaneously validated gravity of situation and also framed Ruth's behavior in recognized category of family abuse. Children between 5 and 7 years are in developmental stage, where separation anxiety is still very active even in children with secure attachment. And when adult in authority position like grandmother deliberately activates those primary fears through narratives about imminent abandonment, psychological damage can be severe and lasting, affecting child's capacity to trust in future relationships and mainly compromising fundamental sense of security in world, she explained educationally. Let's watch recording now so I can specifically assess nature and severity of psychological tactics employed by Ruth, and mainly to document evidence that may be necessary if you decide to seek legal intervention through restraining orders or potentially child abuse proceedings. Sylvia instructed while adjusting notebook position for optimal viewing of laptop screen I had brought, containing that impossible recording. I connected laptop and started playback of that recording I had already watched 3 times. But that still maintained power to shock and emotionally devastate each time I heard Ruth's voice pronouncing those cruel lies with theatrically compassionate tone that masked underlying calculated malice. Daniela and Sylvia watched in professional silence during entire 2-hour duration of footage, occasionally exchanging significant looks during particularly disturbing moments when Ruth elaborated details about abandoned children trying to survive alone, or when she explicitly instructed not to tell anyone about situation. When recording finally ended with image of Ana Clara and Rafael sitting embracing on sofa processing that impossible reality that had been imposed on them, Sylvia remained silent for long moments mentally processing everything she had witnessed, before beginning professional analysis that would frame that behavior in clinical and mainly legal context, to guide appropriate next steps. Carolina, what we just watched clearly constitutes severe child psychological abuse that, in my professional opinion, requires immediate intervention through multiple channels, including complete removal of Ruth's access to your children, complete psychological evaluation of her to determine if she's experiencing psychological disorder that compromises judgment, and mainly intensive therapy for Ana Clara and Rafael focused on processing trauma and rebuilding sense of security that was deliberately destroyed, Sylvia declared with professional authority. Additionally, specific tactics employed by Ruth, including instructing children not to tell other adults about situation and veiled threats about being separated, if authorities discovered, reveal her clear awareness about inappropriate nature of her actions, which eliminates potential defense that she was simply expressing legitimate concerns inappropriately instead of deliberately executing calculated psychological abuse. She continued methodically building case that could be presented to legal authorities if necessary. Daniela, who had remained silent during Sylvia's analysis, finally intervened with additional perspective, based on her knowledge of my family history, and mainly about relationship dynamics between me and Ruth, that we had discussed during previous conversations, when I initially shared concerns about children's behavioral regression. Carolina mentioned to me previously that Ruth had started participating in online groups about grandparents' rights a few months ago, and I'm wondering if she may have been influenced by toxic narratives promoted in those spaces. Daniela's observation awakened specific memory that had been buried during emotional chaos of last hours about casual conversation with Ruth approximately 4 months earlier, when she mentioned having discovered wonderful online community of grandparents who shared experiences about being unfairly distanced from grandchildren by controlling adult children who didn't value intergenerational relationships. At that time, that information seemed simply harmless social hobby for lonely elderly persons seeking community connections. Ruth mentioned about 4 months ago that she was participating in online forums about grandparents' rights, but at time I didn't pay attention, thinking it was just social activity for her to feel less isolated after we established our independent family. I confessed feeling growing guilt about not having recognized that potential warning sign about progressive radicalization through exposure to paranoid narratives that apparently had convinced Ruth that I was deliberately distancing her from grandchildren. Sylvia gravely nodded as if that information confirmed hypothesis she had been formulating during viewing of recording. Those online groups frequently function as echo chambers that amplify resentments and mainly encourage dramatic confrontational actions intended to publicly expose supposed abuses by adult children, using tactics that include documenting emotional reactions through secret recordings that can be presented out of context as evidence of aggressive or unstable behavior. She explained, validating concerns I had about Ruth's possible motivations. Pattern we observed in recording where Ruth is planting narratives about abandonment while simultaneously positioning herself as only person who genuinely cares about children's well-being is classic parental alienation tactic recommended in these forums to create grandchildren's emotional dependency on grandmother, while destroying their trust in biological parents. Sylvia continued building systematic analysis that made disturbing sense of impossible situation. First absolute priority is ensuring Ruth has no additional unsupervised access to children until complete psychological evaluation is conducted, and mainly until she acknowledges harmful nature of her actions and submits to appropriate treatment if necessary, Sylvia instructed with professional firmness. This probably will require seeking temporary restraining order through family court, which means you'll need to hire a lawyer specialized in family law tomorrow. Second, you need to schedule complete psychological evaluations for Ana Clara and Raphael, with child trauma specialists who can officially document emotional impact of Ruth's manipulations, which will be crucial both for appropriate therapeutic treatment and for possible legal proceedings that establish severity of perpetrated abuse. Sylvia continued methodically building comprehensive action plan that simultaneously addressed immediate protection needs and documentation for future interventions. Third, I strongly recommend you maintain this recording in multiple secure locations, including copies with your lawyer, with me, and potentially in password-protected cloud storage, because this evidence will be fundamental for any legal proceeding, and mainly because Ruth may try to deny behavior or claim it was taken out of context if there isn't irrefutable documentation. She pragmatically warned about importance of preserving evidence that captured nature and extent of abuse. Daniela, who had been attentively listening to Sylvia's systematic analysis, finally offered additional perspective based on her knowledge of my personal history and mainly about relationship patterns between me and Ruth that we had discussed during previous sessions when I still hadn't connected her historical controlling behavior with possible escalation to active abuse against my children. Carolina, you mentioned during previous conversations that you always felt Ruth had difficulty accepting your independence after you married and established your own family, and mainly that she frequently made comments about you not sufficiently valuing her advice about raising children, Daniela gently recalled. It's possible her participation in these online groups validated pre-existing resentments, and mainly provided ideological justification for actions she perhaps was already contemplating. Daniela's perceptive observation connected dots I had been trying to process in isolation during last hours about how Ruth had reached point of executing that type of elaborate psychological abuse against own grandchildren, suggesting that instead of sudden and inexplicable transformation, that behavior represented escalation of historical controlling patterns that had been amplified and radicalized through exposure to narratives that framed my maternal independence as rejection of her. Sylvia nodded, agreeing with Daniela's analysis before adding clinical context about how vulnerable individuals can be progressively radicalized by online communities that systematically exploit insecurities and fears to transform participants into perpetrators of behaviors they never would have contemplated independently. People experiencing social isolation, challenging life transitions like aging and loss of significant roles, or history of controlling relationships are particularly vulnerable to online radicalization, she explained educationally. These groups frequently present narrative where grandparents are victims of systematic alienation campaign by selfish adult children who want to cut intergenerational connections. And this ideological framework can transform normal resentments about family changes into paranoid conviction that there exists active conspiracy that justifies dramatic actions to protect grandchildren and publicly expose supposed parental neglect or abuse. Sylvia continued building picture that made disturbing sense of how Ruth could have reached point of deliberately traumatizing children she supposedly loved. Sylvia's words offered explanatory framework that helped process Ruth's incomprehensible behavior through lens of ideological radicalization instead of simply pure malice, but simultaneously didn't absolve her responsibility for conscious choices to participate in those communities, internalize toxic narratives, and mainly execute abusive tactics that caused real and documented psychological damage to innocent children who had been entrusted to her care. So you're suggesting Ruth may genuinely believe she's protecting Ana Clara and Rafael by planting these narratives about abandonment instead of recognizing she's causing severe psychological trauma? I asked, trying to reconcile image of my mother as person capable of maternal love with videographic evidence of behavior so deliberately cruel that seemed incompatible with any definition of appropriate care. Sylvia carefully considered my question before responding with professional nuance that recognized complexity of situations where abuse perpetrators may be operating under distorted belief systems that frame harmful actions as necessary and even heroic. It's possible Ruth has constructed internal narrative where you and Marcos really plan abandonment, or at least progressive emotional neglect, and that she's preparing children for inevitable reality instead of recognizing she's fabricating completely fictional scenario, she cautiously speculated. However, her explicit instructions for children not to tell other adults about situation reveal awareness that behavior would be considered inappropriate by external observers, which complicates argument that she was acting purely based on delusions without capacity to recognize harmful nature of actions. Sylvia warned about limits of radicalization framework as complete explanation that would eliminate Ruth's responsibility for conscious choices that resulted in documented child trauma. Daniela, who had been silently processing that clinical discussion about Ruth's possible motivations, finally intervened with practical recommendation about how to navigate emotional complexity of feeling simultaneously justified anger about damage caused and also potential compassion if Ruth really was experiencing some type of psychological impairment exacerbated by toxic external influences instead of acting with pure and conscious malice. Carolina, regardless of Ruth's underlying motivations or how much she genuinely believes in narratives she internalized through these online groups, objective fact remains that she caused severe and documented psychological trauma to your children that requires immediate intervention to prevent additional damage, Daniela emphasized with gentle firmness. You can process questions about her mental health and potential for compassion later, but absolute priority now must be protection of Ana Clara and Rafael. Daniela's wise words reoriented conversation focus from speculations about Ruth's psychological state to concrete actions we needed to take immediately to ensure my children's emotional safety. Offering implicit permission to prioritize their well-being over complex ambivalences about legally confronting my own mother, who might be experiencing psychological disorder, instead of simply acting with conscious cruelty. Sylvia agreed with Daniela's pragmatic redirection before offering to summarize specific recommendations we had discussed during that emergency consultation. I'll prepare detailed professional report analyzing recording and documenting my assessment that captured behavior constitutes severe child psychological abuse, which you can provide to lawyer and potentially to court if you seek restraining order, she generously offered. I'll also provide referrals for colleagues specialized in child trauma who can conduct evaluations of Ana Clara and Rafael. I effusively thanked Sylvia and Daniela for their availability in middle of night to help me process devastating discovery, and mainly for providing professional framework and concrete action plan that transformed paralyzing emotional chaos into specific steps we could execute to protect our children and legally confront Ruth's behavior. When I finally returned home at approximately 2 a.m, I found Marcos still awake, methodically working on document chronologically listing all behavioral regression incidents correlated with period of Ruth's supervision exposure. How was meeting with Daniela and her colleague? Marcos asked with evident concern while I entered room still carrying laptop containing that impossible recording that now represented critical evidence in potential child abuse case that would permanently transform our extended family dynamics. During following 20 minutes, I reported Sylvia's analysis about gravity of psychological abuse captured on video, and mainly about her recommendations for next steps, including restraining order, children's psychological evaluations, and systematic documentation for possible legal proceedings. Marcos attentively listened to my detailed report, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific aspects of professional recommendations, before sharing his progress in documenting chronology of traumatic symptoms that temporally correlated with period of Ruth's access to children. Based on notes I kept in calendar about children's behaviors during last months, first manifestation of increased nighttime anxiety occurred exactly 9 days after Ruth began caring for them regularly, progressively followed by nighttime bedwetting 11 days later, and finally by explicit panic attacks 17 days after beginning. He reported with analytical precision. Tomorrow, first thing I'll call that family law specialist lawyer we used during house adoption process, explain situation, and request emergency consultation to discuss options about restraining order, and mainly about strategies to protect children while potentially seeking mandatory psychological evaluation of Ruth to determine if she's experiencing disorder that compromises judgment. Marcos declared with pragmatic determination, establishing concrete plan for following day. I gratefully agreed with his initiative while finally allowing physical and emotional exhaustion from that impossible day to conduct me to bedroom where Ana Clara and Rafael slept restlessly in our bed. Small bodies curved against each other, seeking mutual comfort against fears that had been so deliberately planted by person who should provide security instead of systematically destroying it through cruel lies calculated to maximize psychological trauma during particularly vulnerable developmental stage. The morning following that night of anguished vigil arrived with cruel luminosity that made impossible to continue hidden in comforting darkness of bedroom, forcing me to confront devastating reality. That nightmare captured on video wouldn't disappear with daylight, but rather would continue inexorably unfolding through weeks and potentially months of legal battles, intensive therapies, and mainly painful process of rebuilding trust that Ruth had systematically destroyed in vulnerable child minds. Marcos had already risen early, preparing comforting breakfast for Ana Clara and Rafael in touching attempt to create artificial normalcy through family routines, but children remained visibly withdrawn, pushing pancakes around plate without characteristic appetite, while asking occasional questions about Grandma Ruth that revealed profound confusion about how person who supposedly loved them could have said such frightening things that completely contradicted everything Mommy and Daddy affirmed daily. First phone call that impossible Friday was to attorney Simone, professional specialized in family law that Daniela had recommended during nighttime emergency consultation, briefly explaining situation about psychological abuse documented on video, and mainly urgent need to obtain restraining order, preventing Ruth from having any contact with Ana Clara and Rafael until complete psychological evaluation was conducted, determining if she was experiencing disorder that compromised judgment. Simone was tan woman 40. 7 years old with straight black hair to waist and determined brown eyes that transmitted combination of professional competence and human sensitivity, developed through years representing families navigating complex crises involving abuse, disputed custody, and mainly situations where apparently normal family dynamics had revealed themselves profoundly toxic and harmful to vulnerable children, exposed to manipulations by adults who exploit positions of authority and trust. Carolina, based on description you provided about behavior captured in recording, including explicit instructions for children not to tell other adults about situation, this clearly constitutes child psychological abuse that justifies seeking emergency restraining order, Simone declared with professional authority after attentively listening to my chronological report of events. I'll prepare petition today for emergency hearing. I'll try to schedule for Monday. But I need you to bring copy of recording and mainly report that mentioned psychologist is preparing documenting abuse severity. Simone's decisive efficiency transforming that devastating discovery into concrete legal actions offered some comfort through sensation that I was finally doing something tangible to protect my children instead of simply emotionally reacting to situation that had so dramatically exploded in our peaceful lives during last impossible 24 hours since I watched that recording through cell phone remotely connected to hidden cameras. Second call was to Dr. Fernando, trusted pediatrician who had accompanied Ana Clara and Rafael since birth, and who knew perfectly their complete medical history, including progressive emotional development that had always been exemplary, until those recent 3 weeks when behavior had so drastically regressed through symptoms that now made disturbing sense considering systematic exposure to narratives about abandonment deliberately planted by Ruth during afternoons of apparently innocent supervision. Carolina, I need to personally evaluate Ana Clara and Rafael today. to officially document physical signs of severe psychological stress, including sleep disturbances, regressive nighttime bedwetting, and mainly to refer them to colleagues specialized in child trauma, who can conduct complete psychological evaluations, necessary both for therapeutic treatment and for legal proceedings you're initiating against your mother. Fernando instructed with professional concern when I explained situation during phone call. The mention of prosecuting my own mother still provoked conflicting emotional ambivalence, where part of me felt guilt about transforming private family conflict into public judicial case, that inevitably would create permanent divisions in extended family. But vivid memory of Ana Clara and Rafael embracing on sofa processing those cruel lies rapidly dissolved any hesitation about need to protect my children, regardless of cost to relationships or complexities about Ruth's possible psychological impairment. Consultation with Dr. Fernando, scheduled for that afternoon at 3 o'clock, provided first opportunity for Ana Clara and Rafael to verbalize traumatic experiences with professional trained in communicating with small children using developmentally appropriate language that validated feelings without traumatizing through insensitive interrogations about painful details they were still internally processing through recurring nightmares and paralyzing anxiety about imminent abandonment. Ana Clara, Rafael, Mommy told me you've been having some scary nightmares during last week's about Mommy and Daddy going away. Fernando gently began during consultation, while children sat nervously in pediatric chairs decorated with colorful characters intended to create comforting atmosphere. Can you tell me what you dream happens in these nightmares? You don't need to be afraid to talk about scary things, because here is a safe place where we can talk about difficult feelings. Ana Clara looked hesitantly at me, seeking implicit permission before beginning to report with small, trembling voice those recurring nightmares where she woke alone in empty house calling for Mommy and Daddy, who never responded because they had left definitively as Grandma Ruth had explained would be inevitable very soon when they finally completely tired of responsibilities of caring for children who demanded so much time and energy they would rather spend on other, more interesting things. Ana Clara's fragmented narrative, repeating almost textually specific phraseology Ruth had used during manipulations captured on video, confirmed those cruel words had been deeply internalized in vulnerable child mind to point of completely dominating her thoughts during moments of vulnerability, like sleep attempts when anxieties about abandonment emerged with paralyzing force, preventing adequate rest, essential for physical and emotional health of 5-year-old child. Raphael's words revealing he had internalized not just fear about abandonment, but also impossible sense of responsibility for protecting younger sister against dangers that 7-year-old child obviously doesn't possess capacity to prevent or repel, demonstrated how Ruth had systematically exploited not just universal separation anxiety in small children, but also specific fraternal relationship dynamics where older brother instinctively feels need to care for younger sister. During weekend that followed that impossible Friday, Marcos and I maintained constant vigilance over emotional well-being of Ana Clara and Rafael through comforting activities intended to rebuild sense of normalcy, and mainly through gentle but honest conversations about situation, using developmentally appropriate language that validated their confusion without exposing them to adult complexities about Ruth's motivations or legal processes being initiated to protect them. Saturday morning, while preparing special breakfast with children's favorite pancakes decorated with fruits forming smiling faces in touching attempt to create moment of joy amid emotional chaos dominating our normally happy house, I received unexpected call from unknown number that revealed itself. Ruth's contact attempt completely ignoring Simone's instructions about avoiding any direct communication until legal matters were resolved through appropriate channels. My first instinctive reaction was simply to refuse answering, allowing call to go to voicemail. But Simone had specifically instructed that any contact attempt by Ruth should be meticulously documented, because violations of legal instructions could strengthen case for restraining order demonstrating pattern of behavior that disrespected boundaries established for children's protection, so I activated call recording and answered with controlled voice prepared for verbal confrontation. Carolina, we need to talk about misunderstanding that happened this week with children before you continue escalating situation through lawyers and legal threats that will only make everything more complicated for everyone involved. Ruth began with voice trying to sound reasonable and conciliatory, but carrying underlying tone of calculated manipulation identical to what she had used during recording traumatizing Ana Clara and Rafael. Ruth's audacious reframing characterizing systematic psychological abuse captured on video as simply misunderstanding revealed either complete lack of understanding about gravity of her actions, or alternatively, Deliberate denial intended to minimize responsibility for damages caused through narratives that framed her behavior as legitimate maternal concern, expressed inappropriately, instead of recognizing calculated cruelty of elaborate lies, specifically intended to destroy small children's trust in own parents. Ruth, there was no misunderstanding whatsoever, because your actions were completely captured on video showing you deliberately telling Ana Clara and Rafael for approximately 2 hours that Marcos and I plan to abandon them, because we're tired of being parents, elaborating horrible details about them being alone without food or protection, and mainly explicitly instructing not to tell anyone about situation. I responded with icy voice-controlling fury that threatened to explode in emotional confrontation that would only serve her purposes. The silence that followed my declaration about existence of recording lasted perhaps 3 seconds, while Ruth processed implication that behavior she presumably believed was private had been documented in irrefutable evidence that eliminated possibility of denying or distorting narrative about what really happened during those afternoons when she exploited exclusive access to systematically traumatize children who should have been under her protection. You installed hidden cameras in your own house to spy on your mother who was generously helping care for your children while you worked. Ruth responded with theatrical indignation, attempting to deflect focus from abuse she had perpetrated to supposed violation of her privacy. Using classic tactic of manipulators who, when confronted with evidence of harmful behavior, try to transform themselves into victims instead of acknowledging responsibility for actions that caused real damages. I installed cameras in my house to protect my children after they began presenting severe symptoms of psychological trauma, including regressive nighttime bedwetting and nighttime panic attacks that made no sense through any explanation except possible abuse during period when you had exclusive access to them. I firmly corrected refusing to be manipulated into defensive position about completely justified decision to monitor well-being of children under supervision of adult who now had proven to be source of trauma instead of appropriate care. This conversation ends now because my lawyer explicitly instructed that any additional communication must be made exclusively through legal representatives. I firmly declared before hanging up call, despite Ruth's growing protests about being unfairly prevented from seeing own grandchildren, by controlling daughter who didn't value intergenerational relationships. Exactly narrative that online forums apparently had planted in her mind through months of exposure to stories of other allegedly alienated grandmothers. Immediately after hanging up, I sent complete recording of that call to Simone, along with detailed transcription highlighting specific points where Ruth had tried to minimize abuse, characterizing it as misunderstanding, inadvertently admitted participation in online forums that influenced her behavior, and mainly violated instructions about avoiding direct contact, demonstrating pattern of disrespect for boundaries established for children's protection that would strengthen arguments for restraining order. Emergency hearing scheduled for Monday morning at 9 o'clock in family court was surreal experience, where I needed to sit in formal room decorated with dark wood and symbols of judicial authority, while Simone methodically presented evidence of psychological abuse perpetrated by my own mother against my children through video recording, reports from Dr. Fernando and Dr. Sylvia, and mainly through my own chronological narrative of events that had transformed previously happy children into anxious children terrorized by imminent abandonment. Judge responsible for case was woman approximately 60 years old with gray hair pulled in severe bun, and eyes demonstrating combination of human compassion with judicial authority developed through decades presiding over family cases involving disputed custody, child abuse, and mainly situations where apparently normal family dynamics had revealed themselves profoundly harmful to vulnerable children, exposed to manipulations by adults who exploited positions of trust. I watched complete recording that was presented as evidence and read reports from medical professionals documenting psychological impact on Ana Clara and Rafael. And based on those evidences, I agree that grandmother Ruth's behavior constitutes severe child psychological abuse that justifies temporary restraining order, preventing any unsupervised contact with children until complete psychological evaluation is conducted and mainly until she demonstrates understanding about harmful nature of her actions, Judge declared with calm authority. Restraining order specified Ruth must submit to complete psychological evaluation, conducted by court-approved professional who would determine if she was experiencing disorder that compromised judgment, and mainly that any future contact with Ana Clara and Rafael would be conditioned on her completing appropriate treatment, if recommended by evaluation, and demonstrating genuine understanding about how her behavior had caused psychological trauma, requiring intensive therapeutic intervention to repair damages. Following weeks were dedicated to establishing regular therapeutic routine with Renata, who patiently worked with Ana Clara and Rafael, using developmentally appropriate techniques including art therapy, where children expressed fears about abandonment through drawings that gradually evolved from dark images of empty house to more colorful representations of united family role. Playing games where they processed narratives about separation and reunification, and mainly gentle conversations validating feelings. Ana Clara and Rafael are demonstrating encouraging progress in processing trauma related to abandonment narratives planted by Ruth, including gradual reduction of nighttime anxiety and mainly rebuilding trust and stability of parental love that was so deliberately attacked during those 3 weeks of exposure to systematic manipulations. Renata reported during feedback session with Marcos and me after 6th meeting with children. Approximately 6 months after initial hearing that established restraining order, Ruth's therapist provided report to court cautiously recommending supervised contact with grandchildren could be gradually reintroduced, beginning with brief sessions in therapeutic environment where trained professional could monitor interactions, ensuring Ruth didn't revert to manipulative patterns, and mainly that children didn't demonstrate signs of traumatization through exposure to person who had caused so much suffering, even if her current behavior seemed genuinely reformed. Decision about allowing that supervised contact was one of most difficult Marcos and I faced during entire Impossible saga, because part of me wanted to completely protect Ana Clara and Rafael from any additional exposure to Ruth, regardless of how much therapeutic progress she had demonstrated. But Renata gently advised that completely denying possibility of reformed relationship with grandmother could eventually create resentment in children when older, if they understood they had been prevented from knowing family member who had genuinely worked to repair damages. First supervised contact session scheduled for Thursday afternoon in Renata's office was emotionally charged experience, where I watched through one-way mirror while Ruth saw Ana Clara and Rafael for first time in 6 months. Her expression showing mixture of joy at being in presence of grandchildren she clearly had missed, and also visible guilt about trauma she had caused through choices she now recognized as profoundly harmful. Ana Clara, Rafael, Grandma is very, very sorry for having said scary things about Mommy and Daddy that weren't true, and that made you have nightmares and be afraid of being abandoned. Ruth began with voice visibly trembling with emotion, while kneeling to be at eye level of children who cautiously observed maintaining physical proximity to Renata, who provided sense of security. Grandma was confused about many things, and mainly was listening to bad advice from people on internet who made me believe things that weren't true about our family. But I worked very hard with my therapist during last months to understand what I did was very wrong, and mainly to learn how to be better grandmother who doesn't scare grandchildren with invented stories. Ruth continued with that combination of genuine vulnerability and accountability her therapist had worked extensively to develop. Ana Clara and Rafael remained silent, carefully processing those words before exchanging look between themselves, silently communicating decision about how to respond to that reconciliation attempt from person who had caused so much suffering, but who now demonstrated remorse that seemed genuine instead of manipulative as her historical behavior had been characterized. Grandma, do you promise you'll never again say scary things about Mommy and Daddy abandoning us? Ana Clara finally asked with small but firm voice, demonstrating impressive courage from 5-year-old child directly confronting source of trauma instead of simply avoiding through emotional withdrawal. That would be more common response to such complex situation. Ruth gravely nodded with tears beginning to stream down face, while solemnly promising she would never say anything that could frighten or hurt them again, and mainly that if ever felt urged to say something inappropriate would immediately talk to therapist, instead of impulsively acting based on fears or resentments that had motivated previous such destructive behavior. Supervised sessions continued weekly during next 3 months, with Ruth consistently demonstrating appropriate behavior that respected established boundaries, and mainly focused on rebuilding relationship based on trust instead of control, interacting with grandchildren through simple activities like board games, story reading, and conversations about school and hobbies without any attempt to plant narratives about her relationship with Marcos and me. After those 3 months of successful supervised contact, Renata cautiously recommended allowing unsupervised visits in public environments like parks or museums, where Ruth could spend quality time with Ana Clara and Rafael, but where presence of other people would provide informal supervision, preventing any attempt to revert to manipulative behaviors that had characterized previous period of documented abuse. 1 year after that impossible afternoon when I first watched through remotely connected cell phone, while Ruth systematically destroyed my children's emotional security through elaborate narratives about imminent parental abandonment, I finally felt we had reached new family equilibrium where Ana Clara and Rafael had completely recovered sense of security through appropriate therapy, and mainly through consistent removal of trauma source. and where Ruth had genuinely worked to recognize damages caused and reform behavior, allowing careful reconstruction of grandmother-grandchildren relationship based on mutual respect. The most important lesson I learned through that devastating experience was that children's protection must always have absolute priority over preservation of family relationships, when those relationships reveal themselves fundamentally harmful, and mainly that vulnerable people can be surprisingly quickly radicalized by online communities that systematically exploit insecurities and fears to transform participants into perpetrators of abusive behaviors. They never would have contemplated independently, but that toxic ideological frameworks frame as necessary and even heroic. The decision to install hidden cameras despite initial moral discomfort about surveillance of close family member had been absolutely crucial to document abuse happening secretly during afternoons of apparently innocent supervision, providing irrefutable evidence that allowed rapid legal intervention protecting my children from additional exposure, and mainly creating foundation for therapeutic processes that repaired psychological damages before they became permanently rooted, affecting future emotional development. Constant vigilance over children's emotional well-being, and mainly willingness to investigate warning signs, like sudden behavioral regression, instead of simply rationalizing as temporary normal phases, had allowed identifying trauma source, while it was still possible to intervene effectively before damages became irreversible through months or years of continued exposure to systematic psychological manipulations. Importance of professional support network, including psychologists specialized in child trauma, lawyers experienced in family law, and mainly doctors who knew children's complete history, couldn't be underestimated because those professionals provided objective framework to evaluate situation and implement appropriate interventions instead of simply emotionally reacting in ways that could inadvertently worsen trauma or create additional legal problems. Mainly, experience reinforced understanding that child psychological abuse frequently is externally invisible without physical marks that would justify immediate intervention, but is equally or potentially more harmful than physical abuse because it attacks foundations of emotional security and trust in relationships that are essential for healthy development of children who depend completely on adults for navigation of complex and frequently frightening world. Ana Clara and Raphael, now 6 and 8 years old respectively, played again joyfully in yard-building imaginary castles and laughing at jokes Marcos invented during family dinners, their vibrant and confident personalities having completely returned after months of appropriate therapy, and mainly after removal of trauma source that had temporarily obscured that natural joy through fears deliberately planted by person who should protect instead of harm. Ruth visited occasionally under informal supervision, participating in structured family activities where her behavior was discreetly monitored to ensure she didn't revert to manipulative patterns, and mainly demonstrating through consistent actions, instead of simply words, that she had genuinely worked to understand damages caused and reform approach to family relationships, basing them on mutual respect instead of control and manipulation that had characterized her historical behavior. The decision to prioritize children's well-being over preservation of traditional family relationships or avoiding public legal conflicts had been absolutely correct, even being painfully difficult in moment. Because protection of vulnerable innocence must always have precedence over emotional comfort of adults capable of protecting themselves through resources that small children simply don't possess. Did you enjoy Carolina's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on screen. Click there because I'll be waiting for you.